On the edge of a quiet coastal village, where the wind always carried the smell of salt and the sea whispered secrets to the shore, lived a poor fisherman named Raymond. He was known by everyone in the village, not for his wealth, for he had none, but for his kindness, his deep eyes full of sorrow, and the strength in his old hands that had pulled nets from the sea for decades. Raymond had lost his wife many years ago, and with no children of his own, the ocean had become both his companion and his enemy. Each morning, he went out into the cold waters alone, hoping the sea would be generous that day. Sometimes it was. Most days, it wasn't. One winter morning, the wind was sharper than usual, and the sea was more restless. Dark clouds covered the sky, and fishermen stayed on the shore, warning each other of the coming storm. But Raymond had no choice. He had no food at home, and the money he earned last week was already gone. His small boat creaked as he pushed it into the gray water, eyes fixed on the horizon. He sailed far, past the other fishing boats, into deeper water where the waves were rougher. Hours passed. His nets were empty, and his hands were frozen from the cold. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard something strange. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again, a faint cry, weak and desperate. He looked around, heart pounding. And then he saw her. Floating near a broken piece of wood was a girl, no more than 10 years old, her hair tangled, her face pale, her lips blue from the cold. She was barely above the water, her body weak, eyes closed, as if she had given up. Raymond's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he jumped into the freezing sea. The water cut through him like knives, but he fought the pain. He swam hard, reaching the girl before she slipped under. He held her tightly and swam back to the boat. It felt like hours, but finally, he pulled her aboard. Shivering and breathless, he wrapped her in the only blanket he had and turned the boat toward home. The storm had begun, waves crashing over the sides, but he didn't care. He held the girl close, whispering, "You'll be okay, Beta. You'll be okay." Back in the village, people rushed to help. The doctor said she was lucky to be alive. She had no ID, no belongings, nothing to say who she was or where she had come from. She couldn't speak for days. Raymond stayed by her side, feeding her warm soup, covering her with extra blankets, keeping the fire going through the long nights. Slowly, she began to heal. She would smile shyly at him and hold his hand tightly whenever he left the room. Weeks passed. The villagers began to talk. Who was she? Where had she come from? But Raymond didn't care. She was safe, and that was enough. He called her Noor, meaning light, because she had brought something back into his life that he thought he had lost forever: purpose. Noor stayed with Raymond. He made a small bed for her beside the fire. He taught her how to clean fish, how to row the boat, how to read the sky for signs of storms. She followed him everywhere, always holding onto his hand. Though she still said little about her past, Raymond never asked. He could see the pain in her eyes, the kind that only time could soften. Life continued. Slowly, the villagers stopped asking questions. They accepted Noor as part of Raymond's life. She began to laugh more, run along the shore, and collect shells. Raymond worked harder than ever, not for himself anymore, but for her, to buy her books, better clothes, and warm food. Some days were harder than others. There were times when the sea gave nothing, and hunger returned to their small home. But they faced it together, always together. One evening, years later, as the sun dipped below the waves and painted the sky orange and gold, Noor stood beside Raymond, now older and slower. She held his hand, as always, and whispered, "Thank you, Baba." He smiled and wiped a tear from his cheek. She had never called him that before. In that moment, everything he had lost in life felt found again. But Raymond had no idea that the quiet girl he had pulled from the sea years ago was not who she seemed. She carried a secret, one that would soon change both their lives in ways he could never imagine. Years continued to pass quietly in the little coastal village. Noor had grown into a thoughtful, intelligent young woman. Her hair was longer now, always tied back when she helped Raymond prepare his nets, and her eyes still carried that distant sadness, though now mixed with strength. She had learned everything the village could offer her, from fishing and cooking to reading old books the village teacher gave her. But there was always a silence around her past, something unspoken that neither she nor Raymond ever dared to touch. Raymond had aged too. His hands, once strong and sure, had begun to shake. His boat, worn by time and salt, could no longer go as far as it once did. On many days, he stayed home, and Noor would take the boat out alone, returning with fish and smiles, assuring him everything was fine even when it clearly wasn't. She cared for him like a daughter would, and he loved her more than life itself. Their home was still poor, but full of warmth, laughter, and memories carved out of the sea's harsh generosity. Then, one cold morning, everything changed. Noor had gone into town to sell some fish, as she often did, but that day she didn't return on time. Raymond sat by the fire, growing more worried with each passing hour. When she finally came back, her face was pale, her hands shaking. She didn't speak, only hugged him tightly and disappeared into her room. The next day, she left again early and came back even later. This continued for days, and Raymond, though curious, didn't press her. He had always respected her silence, trusting she would speak when she was ready. One night, Noor finally sat beside him and began to speak, not just in soft words, but with a voice steady and full of purpose. She told him everything. She remembered who she was. Her name wasn't Noor. Her real name was Amani. Years ago, she had been in a car with her family during a winter vacation near the coast when their vehicle crashed into the frozen lake. Everyone else had drowned. She had somehow survived, floated far from the crash site, and lost consciousness. What followed was darkness, until Raymond pulled her from the water. Raymond listened in silence, overwhelmed. She continued. A few weeks ago, while selling fish in the nearby city, she had seen her name on a missing persons board, still listed after all these years. Her relatives had been searching. She had spoken to the authorities and gone through a long process to confirm her identity. DNA tests proved it. She was the lost daughter of a wealthy family from the city, a family that had never stopped looking for her. They had thought she was dead, but she had been living all this time in a forgotten village by the sea, with a fisherman who had saved her life. Raymond sat quietly as tears rolled down his cheeks. Not because she was leaving, though he feared she would, but because a part of him had always known she came from another world. What he hadn't expected was what she said next. Amani told him she had no intention of leaving him behind. The world may know her as someone else, but to her, she was Noor, and he was Baba. She had refused to return to the city until she could bring him with her, until she could find a way to repay the life he had given her. Raymond was overwhelmed. He had lived his entire life believing nothing good ever came to men like him. He had given love without expecting it back. But here was proof that even in the deepest sorrow, kindness was never lost. The next weeks moved quickly. Officials came to the village. Paperwork was completed. And then, one day, Raymond, the old fisherman with tired hands and a lifetime of struggle, stepped into a world he had never imagined. For the first time in his life, he wore new clothes that didn't smell of the sea. He stood inside tall buildings where everything shone and buzzed with life. But through all the noise and change, he stayed close to Noor, or Amani, the girl he had pulled from death who now walked beside him, proud and strong. She took him into her home, a large, peaceful place surrounded by trees and silence, far from the sea. She introduced him to people who looked at him with curiosity and sometimes with disbelief. But she always stood beside him, holding his hand just as she had when she was a child. Raymond didn't care for the wealth, the lights, or the comfort. What mattered was that Noor was happy, safe, and still his. But even in the heart of a new life, he often missed the sea, the smell of salt, the creak of the boat, the cold wind in his face. Noor noticed. She arranged a small garden for him, filled with seashells, sand, and a gentle fountain that whispered like waves. It wasn't the ocean, but it was enough. At night, they would sit together by the fire, just like they had in the old house, and she would listen to his stories, now richer with memory. Though the world called her Amani now, in their quiet space, she was still Noor. And Raymond was still Baba. What had begun as an act of blind kindness in a storm had become a bond stronger than blood, a story that no one could believe but everyone admired. But fate had not yet revealed all its cards. Something unexpected was still waiting, a final turn in their journey. One that would test everything they had built and everything they meant to each other. Months passed, and Raymond slowly adjusted to life in the city, though he never stopped feeling like a stranger among its tall buildings and endless noise. People treated him with respect now, even admiration, but he remained humble, always preferring quiet corners and simple food. Noor, Amani, had become a symbol of hope in the eyes of many. News had spread about her miraculous survival, the years spent hidden away in a fishing village, and the man who had saved her life. Yet, despite the attention and admiration, she remained grounded, always by Raymond's side. determined to give back to the man who had once given her everything. She arranged for him to receive medical care for his old injuries, bought him a comfortable home near hers, and hired people to assist him. But Raymond still woke early, still cleaned things with his own hands, and still preferred worn-out clothes over new ones. Old habits, shaped by a lifetime of poverty, never truly faded. He smiled more now, laughed with her, and watched her build a new life filled with meaning and purpose. But just as life seemed to settle, another storm approached, one that no one had expected. Raymond began to fall ill. It started with weakness in his legs, then his breathing became shallow, and soon he could no longer walk without help. Doctors ran tests, and the results came back quietly devastating. His body was failing, slowly but surely. A lifetime of hard labor, cold winters, poor nutrition, and untreated pain had finally caught up with him. Nor sat beside him in the hospital, her eyes full of the same helplessness he once saw in her when she was a little girl, cold and drowning. She tried everything, specialists, treatments, therapies, but there was only so much money could do. Raymond knew this was the last chapter of his journey, and he wasn't afraid. He had lived a full life, one filled with struggle, but also with love and purpose. What more could a man ask for? During his final days, he often asked to be taken outside. Nor would wrap him in a blanket and sit beside him as they watched the sky change colors. He would tell her stories of his youth, of his wife, of the sea, and of the day he found her floating in that frozen water. He would squeeze her hand and smile, saying that saving her had been the best moment of his life. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Raymond passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Noor holding his hand. He left the world as quietly as he had lived in it, surrounded by love, with no regrets in his heart. Noor buried him near the sea. She made sure his grave faced the water, just the way he would have liked. The funeral was simple, attended by villagers, city dwellers, and people who had heard the story and been touched by it. After his passing, Noor didn't return to her normal life immediately. She spent weeks in solitude, grieving not just for the man who saved her, but for the father she had lost. Eventually, she began building something new, something in Raymond's memory. She sold the luxury house and moved into a simpler home by the coast. On that land, she started a foundation for orphaned children and struggling fishermen, offering food, shelter, education, and hope. She named it Nouri Raymond, the Light of Raymond. Children who had no one found family there. Fishermen who had no help found support. And in every room of the center, Raymond's story was told, not as a tale of sadness, but as one of love, sacrifice, and the power of quiet kindness. Years passed, and the story of the poor fisherman who saved a drowning girl lived on in the hearts of many. Books were written, documentaries made, and speeches given, but Noor never sought fame. She simply lived as he had taught her. With humility, strength, and love. Every morning, she would walk to the shore, close her eyes, and listen to the waves, believing somewhere, somehow, Raymond was still there, watching over her, proud of the woman she had become. And every evening, as the sky turned gold and the wind whispered through the trees, she would light a lantern at his grave, a symbol that his light had never faded. It had only grown stronger, touching lives far beyond the village where a lonely fisherman once lived, loved, and quietly changed the world forever.